Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the creative director of RuneQuest and all things BRP. We talked about breaking canon in an established TTRPG setting, not just a small alteration, but fundamentally changing how the lore of a world your players are familiar with works. I started off the interview by asking Jason what the most radical departure from an established setting he's been a part of was. I'll jump across the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
That is a very good question. I think the from my most recent experience, it would have to be that we simply for the Conan RPG and that we simply decided that there was no such thing as just evil people, like evil cultures. And for example, Stygia, which the serpent-haunted kingdom, of black sorcery and evil serpent worshippers, we had to decide, like, well, if people want to play Stygian characters, then having them just immediately be the bad guys, it's not playable and it's not really fun for everyone else. And so we decided that we were going to shift into, it has a government, a theocracy that is in fact kind of evil and is dedicated to this nihilistic serpent worship, the cult of Set. But also there are normal Stygians. There are people who live outside the cities and who try to thrive, just people trying to get by day to day, so to speak. There are heroes who could be Stygians. And so I think the biggest part of that, the most radical shift, which didn't in fact feel like a game breaker or anything, and it certainly didn't break the lore, but we were just deciding, look, we're going to shift away from the stereotypes. The land of Hyperborea, which was only rumored, it's like a slaving raiding culture. I was like, well, there are people who live there who probably aren't immediately involved with raiding or slaving, just like, all of Scandinavia, everyone wasn't a Viking. So I would say that was a huge a sort of shift. And also Picts, the cultural Picts in Conan are almost inevitably enemies because they're sort of the Native American equivalents in a culture that's we're seeing them through the colonialist eyes, whereas getting away from that and having the idea that you can have Pict characters and you can they can interact with people of the world was, I think, a very radical shift, stepping away from the straight Robert E. Howard lore.
So a lot of the examples you've given here obviously are colored by the lens that you are a tabletop professional. You have to put a lot of this stuff into books, you have to be able to distribute to people, and you have to think about everybody approaching things from a different play style. Is it different when you are just playing as you, when you're running a game in an established world? Do you find yourself being wilder, less wild?
I'm a lot more open to improvisation and shifting and letting players kind of define what the borders of the setting are. I think that generally my in-game and campaign mode is a lot looser and a lot more improvisational and collaborative with my players, because ultimately we're all together. Whereas when I'm writing, I have to have an authorial, sort of the authoritative voice and say, this is how it probably we think it should be. Whereas at the table, I'm like, what do you want it to be?
So on that note, how far is too far? If I'm running a Star Wars TTRPG and I decide to kill off all the Jedi, suddenly the Force stopped working. Or if I'm running Lord of the Rings, but I take out the rings, how far can you go without, I know that you strongly believe that anything is possible in TTRPGs, without making things really difficult for yourself?
Well, there's difficult for yourself and then difficult for the players. And I think that those are very different things. I mean, I once played in a rather strange game of Serenity / Firefly. I can't remember which iteration it was. And the game master introduced aliens, which was like everyone at the table, there was just a sudden, like a stop where we went, oh, this is not that setting at all. Okay. How are we going to react to that? And I think that there is a danger, like the how far is too far. You have to sort of like look at what is the core of the IP. And then when I mean, I think it's totally fine to imagine, killing off all the Jedi. Sure, that's canon. Um, does the Force stop working? Why does it stop working? And I think that when you make fundamental changes like that to the philosophical underpinning of the universe, if I might get all woo woo and big picture here, it causes players to lose their grip on the setting. Now it's entirely possible to do a Star Wars game, to use that example again, that's entirely absent from the Force, from the Jedi. I mean, we've now seen ample examples of fantastic storytelling that has nothing to do with the Skywalker saga or Jedi or the Force. I don't even think anyone said, "May the Force be with you," in the entirety of the Andor series. And that's like one of the best examples of Star Wars, the IP I've seen in my life on Earth. But at the same time, if you get a little too far, or you go kind of you just introduce elements that are, I think, jarring, then the question, like the players, in some cases they play because they want to play. They want to play Firefly because they want to play Westerns in space. If they are and then if you suddenly done this kind of like tone shift, screeching, now we're doing something else, from the game master point of view, it might be completely awesome. Like it might be exactly what I had planned, but trying to wrangle the players into a heel turn so quickly I think that's kind of the problem, because in some cases you'll lose players, like their interests will just be like, they'll just get thrown off the wagon, so to speak, if you make a turn too steep.
The next logical question is to ask about how to make changes well, but rather than having such a broad approach, I want to mention a couple of different things that I think people run up against when they are trying to make changes to established settings, and get your quick fire thoughts on each of those, if that's all right.
Sure.
To start off with, what about killing main characters? Is it fine to just take people who are very, very established in the setting and get rid of them in order to demonstrate that you are going in a different direction?
Well, there's I'm going to ask or rather state that you've stated two different things: getting rid of them and killing them. Now, for example, I was thinking of one of those Star Wars computer games where they very deliberately had a scene where Han Solo and Chewbacca are killed horribly on screen. And I know a lot of players who just went, no, that was their exit point from that game. They just stopped, to where it was like a requirement to keep playing, as you had to sort of watch this two beloved characters get murdered. And I think there's one thing for killing the characters, and the other to just get them off screen. And I think that for many IP or many licensed games or many games with a lot of lore that come in, it's almost necessary to get the characters off screen, the main characters off screen.
I hear what you're saying. I've got a more precise wording, because
but you can have that. I mean, it's just, again, are the players emotionally attached to this, and will this be an exit point for them?
Yeah, which is a great point. What I do mean, though, is making a fundamental change, because it's not just getting rid of them. Don't worry, Frodo and Sam were busy today, so they can't take care of this adventure. It's for you. I mean, something more central to the story. You have, for example, Iron Man decide to not set up the Avengers at all and go and join an evil side, or start to distribute weapons for the baddies, or maybe not something so extreme that violates the character, but
in fact, that actually sounds pretty cool. Like Marvel, of course, with their whole "what if" explored that metaphor quite well. And frankly, I think that the superhero genre is especially amazing for these sort of variant tales. Like, what if the X-Men were bad guys? What if Spider-Man were a villain? Then you could have a lot of fun with playing in that world with that huge tonal difference. But I think that one of the things that is interesting is, if you're going to make one of these changes and you want to figure out how to do it, like really go back and figure out what is the setting itself going to be with this tonal change. And I mean, a setting where Iron Man or, Tony Stark is revealed to be the grand bad guy, that could be very cool. Is that like a beginning thing, or is that a shift that happens, like a sudden revelation where you go, oh my God, Stark Industries is doing all this. It must be that Obadiah Stane guy. And then you realize, no, it's Tony. He's the evil guy. He's the Ironmonger. To go deep into Marvel lore there.
Well done. So what about subtlety in doing this kind of thing? A lot of the time you'll be running a game, and if you are running a world that players might not be very experienced with, they might not know the deep lore of the entire IP or the specific region that you're dealing with. Should you be upfront when you're changing the canon, or is it okay to mess with things and not tell your players in order to keep that suspension of disbelief stronger?
I think that you need to sort of look at or try to get a sense for who the players are, because one player might be, unfamiliar, and then you may have another player who's sitting in the back just going like, no, that's not right. And that can create some tension within the group. I think that if you can handle these things subtly, it's for the best, because then people are a lot more open to things. I also think that just presenting the game setting as being it's a test and you have to pass, but you may not have studied for it, is a dramatic a mistake. I think that anything that happens at the table should be open to collaboration, and that no, you're wrong, doesn't work like that, sorry, is one of the least interesting things a game master can say to a player, and one of the most demoralizing.
What shouldn't you change? You mentioned before that the philosophical underpinnings of an entire IP is something you don't want to touch. Is it just those grand things, those like very deep points, or is there some very specific advice that you can give us about never change this particular detail or something like that?
I think everything is on the table, to be honest with you. I think that you can change the grand philosophical underpinnings, but you need to be clear about that from the get-go. You need to let the players know about it. I'm not entirely sure that for a licensed game, that's a good idea, because at a certain point, you're making a licensed product and people buy they want to play the licensed game because they want to play the licensed game. They don't buy, Glorantha and then find out that it's all about Sentai hero teams, and it's suddenly you assemble your fighting force and they have their colorful costumes and you transform into a giant Orlanth or whatnot. I think people would be like, well, that is not what I was expecting when I was going to be playing RuneQuest. I mean, those kinds of situations. But my gut feeling is that the things you shouldn't change are the things that allow freedom at the table. I don't like saying things like, oh, this, like, I'm going to change it so only these kind of players can be this, or I don't like putting down walls. And in some cases, the game designers have very specifically lifted walls, and open doors in the setting so that they can be more inclusive, they can be more collaborative for all kinds of different players, and so that they don't restrict players from being what they want to be. And I think that bringing those restrictions back, or emphasizing conditions in the world that are unfavorable to certain types of players, I think that making everything crappier for everybody is a bad idea. I know that may be a revolutionary thought, but just the notion of kind of trying to limit players' freedoms as a change to IP seems like a mistake.
So then let's talk about the best examples of this, because fundamentally, when you jump into an IP-driven tabletop role-playing game, very often it's because you're going to make changes. You're not going to jump in and all play as the exact characters with the same story.
Right.
You're going to change the canon. What are some games or some techniques that are used by effective games that make the story receptive and engaging and easy to manipulate in a way that is rewarding for everyone involved?
Well, I mean, I think that, for example, if I might be a little, I don't know if it's self-congratulatory is, but pointing at a Chaosium product, I think that with Glorantha and RuneQuest, the idea of advancing the timeline beyond the lunar Sardarite conflict and no longer making the entire setting about this sort of dialectic between evil lunars versus good Sartorites, good people of Dragon Pass. I think it opens things up quite a lot. It opens things forward, which for the most part is a lot bigger, and it creates a more interesting, like Casablanca style cultural mix, which I think is a lot cooler. You know, there's shades of gray, there's some nuance. You can have lunar or Tarshite characters that are you know, maybe some of the old rivalries are still there, but they're also still open to collaboration.
So if you'll let me pick that apart for just a second, you
Sure.
said that that was done by moving the timeline forward. So is the outcome there move away slightly from the established setting, put yourself in a region or a time frame that is a bit different so that you have enhanced freedom?
Sure. I think that was our approach. We wanted to keep things focused on Sartar and the central Dragon Pass area, but at the same time, we realized that the old timeline was, you know, like where things were in the setting was very, very restrictive. And ultimately, too, just from a sheer, you know, product management point of view, continuing to publish works in that time frame, in that exact setting, would have been really just, you know, adding more stuff onto products people already have. You know, it would have been a lot of reprints that are exactly the same products people had, you know, 30 years ago. And I think that opening things up and making things a little broader and a little more I don't know, freewheeling has given us a lot more room to play with. And again, too, when you mention central figures, even though in RuneQuest, you know, Argrath is this like major figure of change in the world, I mean, ultimately, gameplay is not about him, you know, and in the same way that like the Star Wars universe has really gotten far more interesting now that Luke Skywalker is not the center of it, or those pesky Skywalker family.